and welcome to Montgomery Talk. I'm Doug Tallman, senior reporter at Montgomery Community Media, coming to you from our podcast studios outside the Rockville corporate limits. Today, I'm speaking with Marc Korman, a member of the Maryland House of Delegates, representing District 16, which includes parts of Bethesda, North Bethesda, and Potomac. He serves on the House Appropriations Committee, a panel that is intimately involved with the $40-some billion state spending plan each year. He is also chair of the Montgomery County House Delegation, which means he will be instrumental in seeing local bills move through the various committees and the floors of the different chambers up in Annapolis. And we're here to talk to him about the upcoming General Assembly session, which will start January 9th in the new year. Welcome, Mr. Korman.
Thanks for having me.
So first, two things from the news. Today's New York Times has a lengthy investigation in how Facebook said one thing concerning how it was protecting users' data and then did something quite the opposite, which makes me wonder who in state government is responsible for protecting sensitive resident data, and how can we be sure that it is protected?
Sure. So it's something I think governments, businesses at all levels are struggling with is, data security. In Maryland, we have something called the Department of Information Technology. It's been around for about 11 years. It's a cabinet-level department that's supposed to oversee our state's IT infrastructure. As part of that, they issue an information security policy that the government is supposed to follow. But I will say that policy is now quite dated. Actually, a constituent flagged for me that policy is 5 years old. So we took a look at it, noticed some things about it that were not quite up to date, and I actually sent a letter to the Department of IT about this, and they brought me in and discussed what they were doing, how they were going to change it going forward, and also how they were going to make sure the other departments were actually following the policy, so it wasn't just something on a website, but something that the departments were actually working on. I should say my colleague, Senator Lee, who also represents District 16, has been very involved in these data privacy, data security issues, so there's a lot of attention on it, but in truth, again, a lot of states, a lot of governments, a lot of businesses are struggling with these same issues, and so we need to make sure our Department of IT and the rest of our government really stays ahead of the curve to protect that really sensitive data.
Are you aware of any breaches of state data?
I'm not aware of any, but regularly there are concerns about probing from various things. That's something that came up with the State Board of Elections. There was a probe done by, I believe, a foreign government, although there was no actual breach there. Our Department of Legislative Services, through their Office of Legislative Audit, regularly audits state agencies, and they often flag information security issues, not necessarily breaches, but concerns about how passwords are being used, for example. And so we always want to make sure that we're responding to those to avoid there being any problem in the future. I mean, the silliest way at this point for someone to breach data is through, an easy password hanging around. Obviously, there's much more significant threats we need to worry about as well. But if you look at the back at almost every audit report, there are issues related to that, and so we really need to make sure that we're getting our whole government, on the same page, to get ahead of these threats.
So when those appear on state audit, what happens? I mean, is there somebody's job to sit back and say these things were fixed?
Yep.
Or?
So the departments issue a response. When the audits are made public, the department's response is there. And in almost all cases, the department agrees with the finding and explains the corrective action they're taking. There are occasionally repeat findings in audits, so they're not usually in the ones I've read in this information security context. Usually, when OLA, the Office of Legislative Audits, flags one of these issues, it's handled pretty quickly by the departments. They realize the error and they just, take the corrective action.
Okay. On Monday, I believe, one other item from the news, and on Monday, it was reported that the Jesuits had released a list of 24 former and some deceased priests in what they call the Maryland province, who had been credibly accused of abuse of minors. 2 years ago, the legislature passed legislation expanding or lengthening the amount of time that a person can take their abuser to court. Is there have you seen anything that says, we need to go back to this, and there are other issues that we need to resolve on this?
Yeah, so my colleague C.T. Wilson, I should say, was really crucial from Southern Maryland, really crucial in passing that legislation due to some really unfortunate personal history of his. And so that was an important change to sort of extend the statute of limitations. I think there's another piece, which is the reporting requirements. Maryland, I think, is the only state, or maybe one of two states in the country, that's missing a certain type of criminal accountability for not reporting certain types of child and sexual abuse. And so I think expanding that would be good. It's something that historically has not been able to get through the judiciary committees of the House and Senate. Those committees have changed quite a bit, as you probably know, since the past election. And so there might be some progress there going forward.
Okay. I guess when you say changes, I guess the biggest one is that Delegate Valerio is no longer in the House of Delegates.
Yeah, so we have we have a new chair in the House Judiciary Committee and a lot of new members. But even on the Senate side, although it's the same chair, we have a new vice chair in Senator Will Smith from here in Montgomery County. We have Senator Jeff Waldstreicher, or Senator-elect Jeff Waldstreicher, is now joining that committee, along with a lot of other new members. Senator Mary Washington from Baltimore City, Senator Jill Carter. So lots of new blood on the Senate side, as well as obviously on the House side with that leadership change you referenced.
And often advocates for lots of issues, not just child abuse, have pointed to former Delegate Valerio's obstructionism, is that the right way to put it, in getting certain bills passed. Would it be a reasonable assumption that it may be a little easier to get bills through judiciary going forward?
It'll obviously be different. I don't think, the proof is in the pudding, so I don't want to speak for the new chair, Lou Clippinger from Baltimore City, but obviously anytime you have a change in the leadership of a committee, there's a change in how that committee functions. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. When I got there, it was a new chair, Maggie McIntosh from Baltimore City. She replaced a long-serving Chair Norm Conway, and the culture of the committee changed. How it functions just changes as a result of new leadership. Just as if you got a new boss here, the way things work here would be different. So there'll probably be some change. You can't guarantee passage of certain bills.
So at the outset, I described how you were a member of the Appropriations Committee, so I have a couple questions about the budget. Comptroller Peter Francho told us that the state was on the brink of receiving oceans of revenue, in part because of the after effects of the Trump tax cut, and in part because of state sales taxes that would be imposed on internet companies. Do you agree that the money will materialize?
So first of all, just to be clear, it's online sales. The state is now allowed to collect those taxes. Those taxes were always supposed to be remitted, but they were not done by most people unless there was a physical presence in the state. The Supreme Court expanded that. So that's a nationwide change. That's not a tax on internet companies that was imposed by the state of Maryland or anything like that. I think that is the most assured sort of stream of revenue in the quote unquote ocean that the comptroller talks about. We've already seen that revenue begin to come in. That should expand for two reasons. One, compliance will improve over time, and two, I think the internet's people are going to continue purchasing things from the internet in higher and higher numbers, and so I think that is a pretty assured stream of revenue. The tax changes, we don't fully know the ramifications of those yet. That's a little less certain. It's not clear how long that increase will last. If changes we make at the state level might affect that change. And so that's a little less assured. But yeah, the revenue estimates are certainly up, and the collections from this past year were certainly up. And so there's a lot more money that appears sort of on our balance sheet for the state. Okay, so where should that money be spent? So I think there's a few different things. One, I think you need to be careful in long-term commitments you make, whether that's in new spending or in tax changes. You want to make sure that the money is actually going to materialize, and we don't create a future imbalance in our budgets. Unlike the federal government, we have to balance our budget every year, and so although there might be a sort of a long-term projected deficit, when we get to that year, we need to balance the budget. Well, right now, even with this new revenue in the out years of our budget projections, there is still an imbalance. There's still a deficit. So I think you'll see some of it dedicated to the rainy day fund. Yesterday, the what's called the Spending Affordability Committee raised our target to 6% of our general fund for our rainy day fund, so we'll put some money there. I think you'll see some interest in other sort of one-time expenditures, capital type expenditures, or money to the pension fund, things like that. And then, of course, we have the Kerwin Commission, which is sort of the big gorilla hanging over our whole legislative session, and obviously that's more in the nature of long-term funding commitments, ongoing operating expenses, but some of the money could be designated towards that. Of course, that's a broader conversation about what that would all cost, what we're trying to do with that, and how we pay for it.
We'll come back to the Kerwin Commission, but on your list of potentials where that money could go, none of it was return to the taxpayer? Do you think there's a room for any sort of rebate or tax cut with this money coming
Well,
from?
I mean, I did reference that there could be changes at the state level that could affect our ability to have this revenue. We made a few changes last year. I wouldn't say anything monumental, but there were changes. There were changes to the earned income tax credit eligibility. We slightly increased and pegged to inflation the standard deduction. I think there could be room to do more. I think it's complicated to figure out exactly who is harmed versus who is held harmless versus who benefits from the changes at the federal level, and trying to figure out exactly how to hold the right people harmless is complicated. I will say in my district, because of the state and local tax deduction cap of $10,000, it's pretty problematic for my district, these federal tax changes and what's going to happen. And I think we're going to see in April, when people are paying their tax bills, a lot of concern about what it looks like to them and their increase potentially in state taxes for some very technical reasons we can get into if you want. So I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation. But I also think we have to recognize that we do have significant needs at the state level. People want to invest in education. People want to invest in transportation. People want to invest in public safety and healthcare. And it takes tax revenue to do that. And so I think we need to be honest about our needs as well.
Going back to Mr. Francho again, he pointed out recently that we are in the 113th month of an economic expansion, and our record is 119 months. So it could very well be that in the next 6 months we are, unless we break a record, sometime in the next 6 months we could be in another recession. So does that factor into the whole political calculus of what to do with this money?
Sure. I mean, there will be another recession, whether it's in 6 months or 16 months or 6 years. There will be another recession. That's how the economy works. It's cyclical, although the length of those cycles varies. Maryland's a little unusual because we actually tend to do a little bit better than the rest of the country during the actual recession. It's the follow-on to recession. So it doesn't mean we do great during recessions. It doesn't mean people suffer. But if you sort of look at the state overall, because the government tends to spend a little bit more money when the economy goes down, that can be beneficial for Maryland because of the size of our federal workforce. So we can withstand that a little bit better, although certainly people still suffer. But then the follow-on, when the government then presses the brakes on spending, and this last time it was federal sequestration, that can really hurt us. But no, clearly, if people are feeling uncertain about the economy, if people have lost their jobs, if they're not spending as much at the store or now on the internet, if they're not getting that same income, clearly that's going to affect our, the revenue we collect at the state. And that's just the time when we want to help people more because they need that help. And of course, the state, participates in Medicaid, food stamps, all sorts of safety net programs. And of course, anytime, we're not investing in education, I think is a pretty short-sighted mistake. So it's a legitimate concern. I'll say our recovery from the Great Recession in Maryland was never all that great. It has not been as robust as we need it to be. That's not a partisan statement. That's been true under governors of both parties. And so that's something also we need to keep an eye on, is our sort of economic strength overall, to make sure when we are coming out of a recession that we're really taking advantage of that recovery. It's been, unfortunate this hasn't been as strong economically in the state as I think we need long term. Okay.
Well, you mentioned the Korman Commission. Could you give the 30-second, 30,000-foot view of what exactly the commission's trying to do?
Sure. So about 15 years ago, there was something called the Thornton Commission that actually came out of some litigation that looked at our state funding for education, our formulas, how the money's allocated. The Korman Commission is the follow-on to that. It was always anticipated there'd be sort of a review of that. It's sometimes referred to as adequacy, the adequacy of our public education. And so they've spent the past 2 years looking at actually, they've mostly been focusing on what we should be spending operating dollars on for education. How should we train our teachers? How many should we have? What should they be teaching? What about pre-K? What about career and technical education? They've really been focusing on that, and now they're shifting a little bit to how the money is going to be allocated and how much it's going to cost to fund all the things they say we need for a really 21st century system of education. And so that report is sort of coming in any day now, and that will be then in the legislature's lap to act on it.
And before you get the report, where are people thinking that the money's going to come from for this?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of discussion about, will you need new revenue? Will you be able to just use the online sales tax increase you described before, or some of the other changes? Can you do some restructuring? And so it's unclear. It depends on how ambitious the report is and how ambitious the legislature wants to be with it to determine how much money you actually need. They're talking about, I think, a $4.4 billion increase over 10 years. That's a lot of money, but of course we already have increases every year, so it's not quite as much as it sounds like. And so I think, it's an open question of will you need new revenue? How much will that be? And will there be the political will to do that? And then, of course, there'll be a discussion of how you divide up the revenue that's gained. Obviously, that's really important for Montgomery County. We are, if you look at us in the aggregate, compared to a lot of the other parts of the state, economically well off and successful, but that doesn't mean we don't have significant needs here. And clearly in the eastern part of the county, there's pockets of poverty everywhere, but particularly in the eastern part of the county, there are really significant needs. And we need to make sure those needs are attended to by the state and not just ignored.
So there is some fear that it's going to mean a net loss for Montgomery County, correct?
There was an early consultant report, actually before the Kerwin Commission itself was appointed. There was a consultant hired by the state to study some of these issues to sort of set the groundwork for Kerwin. And in one of their reports, there were 3 counties that were going to have under one of their proposals, sort of a net loss in state funding, with the thinking being that the local government would fill in that gap. That was a consultant report. Consultant reports are very nice. They can have lots of useful data. That's not really in touch with the political process here in Maryland. I don't think any jurisdiction, but particularly Montgomery County, which has the largest delegation in the House, is going to see an actual cut in funding from the state. I think we're really talking about how our increases, if increases happen, going to be allocated among the jurisdictions more than anybody actually facing a cut. But it's something to be attentive to, make sure we understand what that recommendation was, why it was there, and be able to explain why we think it's incorrect.
Okay, well, I think now would be a good time to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more Montgomery Talk with Delegate Marc Korman. I'm Doug Tallman, Senior Reporter at Montgomery Community Media. And we have a couple of non-Montgomery politics questions for him as well. So be sure to come back.
MCM, your community media center, is making Montgomery County a great place to live through programs like 21 This Week. Montgomery County's hardest-hitting political talk show keeps you up to date with the local political scene. Montgomery Community Media. Our middle name is Community.
And we're back with more Montgomery Talk with Delegate Marc Korman, and we're talking about the upcoming General Assembly session. I'm Doug Tallman, Senior Reporter at Montgomery Community Media. We ended the last segment talking about the budget, and one thing I don't think that came up was school construction. The governor has his own $1.9 billion plan that he unveiled a couple days ago. I don't know if you saw Barry Rascovar's take on it, but he thought it was he thinks it's just a way to short circuit the Kerwin Commission funding. And I'm not going to go into his logic on that one on here, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on what the governor proposed?
Yeah, so first of all, we have, a lot of issues with school construction every year, really important to Montgomery County. Obviously, we have a lot of schools over capacity, and we also have a lot of schools that just have the normal wear and tear maintenance issues that need significant investment. And we've worked pretty hard at that, at least during my 4 years in the legislature. As part of a much broader team effort, we've had an over 50% increase in the state contribution to school construction in Montgomery County. Now, look, that's all Marylanders' tax dollars. It's not as though whether it comes from the county or state, it's still from the taxpayers. But in terms of that accounting, we've had a nice increase from the state level. There's obviously more to do. What the governor's proposed is obviously sort of an opening bid in negotiations for both Kerwin and school construction, how to use the quote-unquote lockbox, the education funding coming from gambling revenue. And so it's going to be a long conversation, but there are things that we definitely need in Montgomery County for school construction. And the idea of a plan similar to what Baltimore City has, where there's sort of a separate stream of bonds that can be supported by both the county and the state to build more schools, is something that we're very interested here in Montgomery County. We'd also like to see the enrollment growth grant increase. That's something that's been really important for Montgomery County, recognizing that schools with fast-growing populations need extra school construction resources. That's been very important to us. There are some other technical changes we can make as well to help how we're doing with school construction. But yeah, that's right along there with Kerwin as something really important to the county when it comes to the state-provided education funding.
Okay. Well, the contracts for school construction obviously go through the Board of Public Works. 1/3 of the Board of Public Works is Nancy Kopp, former delegate. I believe she served in your district.
She did. They actually don't go through the Board of Public Works anymore. There was a change made last year that there's now the Interagency Commission on School Construction. The governor's proposal would try to revert some of that power back to the Board of Public Works. Frankly, I see no reason why we would change that back. That just doesn't make a ton of sense to me to roll that back right after we just made this reform, so I don't expect that to happen.
Okay. Getting back to Nancy Kopp, she has been criticized by Baltimore delegates as being too cozy with the governor and Francho and not doing, I believe the phrase was, the needs of the party, which seems kind of an odd phrase for someone who's really just signing checks on contracts. If she gets voted out, what happens to Montgomery County's role in Annapolis?
So one, I don't think she's going to be voted out, although that's a process that plays out in January. As you know, the state treasurer is selected by the legislature. Each member of the legislature, each delegate, each senator has one vote. I suspect that Nancy Kopp, if she wants to continue serving, will be able to do that. She's done a great job for us, not necessarily as a party, because that's not really her role, but representing the legislature's interest. It happens that the legislature's majority Democrat, but representing the legislature's interest at the Board of Public Works. I think she's been, obviously great for Montgomery County. It's great as a District 16 delegate when we have affairs of state in the legislature, and I look to the front and I see Brian Frosch, another former District 16 delegate, then state senator, now attorney general, sitting in the front next to Nancy Kopp, next to Peter Francho, who's also from Montgomery County. That's obviously a great thing. But if you look at our strength in Annapolis, it's also grounded in the legislature. If you look in the House, 2 of the 6 standing committees are chaired by members from Montgomery County. The majority leader, Kathleen Dumais, is from Montgomery County. The House Democratic Caucus chair, Eric Lukey, is from Montgomery County. We have numerous subcommittee chairs. The 24 of us are the largest delegation in the state. So our strength in Annapolis exists apart from Nancy Kopp, although having Nancy there is great. She's done a great job. I hope she'll continue to serve. Okay, but I guess the question then becomes, although you seem confident that she won't get voted out, I believe it was Talmadge Branch who was the one who raised questions about her role in the Board of Public Works. He's an influential member of the Baltimore City delegation. Is your confidence well-founded? Well, to be honest with you, I haven't heard much about any kind of race yet. I mean, 4 years ago when we voted on the treasurer, there was one candidate. It was Nancy Kopp. I don't know how it was the years before that. I was not in the legislature prior to that. I have not heard about an alternative candidate to Nancy Kopp. I have not heard about anybody challenging her or running against her, so I have no reason to believe she's not going to continue serving if she wants to. If we get to the point where there's an actual race for it, I'm happy to come back and talk about what that looks like and who the candidates are and why Nancy Kopp should continue serving. But at this point, there's just no indication of a change. Okay. How would you rattled off all the folks from Montgomery County who are serving in committee and vice chairman roles in the committees. What is Montgomery County's clout in Annapolis? We've got all these positions, yet it seems like it's a struggle every year for the state's largest jurisdiction to get school construction funds, to get education funds, to get bills through. Curious what. Yeah, I don't know if it's a struggle. I think there's a legislative process we have to follow, and lots of places in the state have needs, and we want to be attentive to those needs. I mean, I'm not for Montgomery at the expense of Hartford, or Montgomery at the expense of Baltimore City, or Montgomery at the expense of Prince George's County. We have a lot of needs here as well, but so does the rest of the state, and a rising tide lifts all boats. I would say we've done a pretty good job of getting the things we need, but we could always do better. We're not going to do better by saying we want more clout or we just want more in isolation. We need to be specific about what it is we're asking for and what it is we need in Montgomery County. School construction is a great example. We've made a concerted effort these past few years to explain why we need more in school construction, and it's happened. We've gotten, like I said, over a 50% increase in school construction. Last year, we made a concerted effort to explain why WMATA, the metro system, is really important, not only to Montgomery County, but obviously we benefit more than most of the state from metro functioning, and we were able to get dedicated funding passed, something that had been a 50-year goal of the region. It wasn't just Maryland. We were part of a regional bipartisan effort. We have things like the biotech tax credit that are really important in Montgomery County that we've been able to see grow and expand over time. The Purple Line was a priority of ours. That's moving forward. So when it comes to our clout and how are we doing, we need to be specific in our wants. We need to explain why they're important to us and the rest of the state, and we need to execute on that. And I think we've actually done a pretty good job on that. When you ask what's our clout, I mean, there's no clout or there's no Q rating for that, right? There's no, we have 9 points out of 10 in clout. We need to go down there with our list of needs, explain why they're important, explain, why we think it's important that the state invest in those things and execute.
Okay. Besides, we talked quite a bit about education, but the other big issue in Montgomery County is transportation. And of course, the gorilla in the room is the expansion of I-270 in the Beltway. What's going to happen in this session concerning those two projects?
Yeah, I think, it's the governor kicked off a process on Rosh Hashanah a year and a half ago, or 15 months ago, and it's sort of moving in parallel universes. On the one hand, the governor made clear that first day that he is planning on, 2 new toll lanes in each direction. So adding, trying to widen the road. And then there's this separate process, the actual legal process that has to be followed, that's actually studying a range of alternatives. I think it'd be nice to see those two worlds meet a little bit and make sure that the political leadership of the state, the governor, the secretary of transportation, are actually following the legal process that's required and actually looking at all the alternatives. For example, Montgomery County has stepped forward with an idea of reversible lanes on 270 as opposed to adding 2 lanes in each direction, which could involve taking some homes and businesses, despite the governor's sort of vague claims to the contrary. How you're going to add more lanes around the Beltway? I mean, you've driven the Beltway. There are some areas there where it seems pretty tight when you have a hospital, a park, houses, all sorts of things. How this is all going to be paid for is very murky. The governor and the secretary have made a lot of grandiose promises. Hard to see how they're going to be able to live up to all those promises. So I think there's a lot of concern about it. It doesn't require, as it's being proposed now, an affirmative vote of the legislature to move forward, but I think you're going to see a desire among legislators to have more of a role, not only because of this specific project, but because of the process the governor's following could be repeated in other projects in the future. And I think we're going to want to make sure that the other co-equal branch of government that's elected for the same term as the governor has a role to play in those processes. The public-private partnership law has value. There's a lot of things about it that I think we like. It's done a good job of rehabbing rest stops on I-95. It's been useful for the Purple Line. It's had other uses. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean we're not going to make some changes to it, sort of regardless of the 274-95 project. But certainly that's, as you said, one of the big gorillas.
A piece of legislation that has already been introduced that I find rather interesting is the enabling legislation to allow ranked choice voting or approval voting in Montgomery County. First, can you explain simply what exactly this is going to entail?
I can try. Delegate Lutke and Senator Kagan have introduced a bill that would allow the Montgomery County Council to make a change in how we vote in local elections in the county. And so the way ranked choice voting, which is the part that's getting most of the discussion, works is basically you rank your candidates in order of preference. And so if someone doesn't get a majority of the vote, the bottom candidates drop off and you sort of reallocate votes until somebody gets a majority, or in the case of our at-large county council, until 4 people would get a majority. This has been done statewide now in Maine, and then I think San Francisco has it locally. A few other places have it for their local elections. And the idea of it is to make sure that people aren't winning with a very small plurality of the vote. When you have 33 candidates running for the Montgomery County Council, for example, you have the potential for someone with very few votes to win. And so the idea of this is just to make sure that the people who ultimately win have a broader, wider base of support. And so I think there's a lot of interest in that, given the volume of candidates we had running and the relatively small percentage people won with. Won't solve all our problems. And I think, the immediate question people ask is, do I have to rank 33 candidates? The answer to that is no. You rank as many as you want, just like now. When you're voting for county council at large, you don't have to vote for 4. You don't have to vote in county council at large at all. You can skip that entirely when you get to that section of your ballot. Similar idea here. It's up to the voter to decide how much they want to do. If they want to rank all 33 candidates, which is something I would probably do, you can do that. If you're more of a typical voter, you'll probably rank 6, maybe 8 candidates, and then you'll stop. But the idea of it is to make sure people winning have majority support, or at least people getting nominated have majority support. I guess I didn't explain that simply enough.
No. I have to admit, the notion of going from just because you're ranking them doesn't necessarily mean they're getting majority support. You may be a voter may be able to express their thought that, here are my 4, and I like this guy too, and I like this woman too, and sure, they get
Yeah, so it's like an instant runoff, if you can think of it that way. So in a normal runoff election, right, what would happen is the top two, I'll just use two, even though with our county council at large, it's a little more complicated, right? With a runoff election, the top two candidates in the first round would go on to the next round, right? And then you're down to two candidates, so one of them has to win majority support. That's, I learned that at Bell Elementary in, 1987. And so this is a way to do that without actually holding another election. It's basically saying, if there was a runoff, how would you treat, candidates differently? And so it's not perfect, but it's a way to basically have what amounts to an instant runoff without the cost and time of another election.
And part of it, I guess where I have the trouble is that the problem to me isn't that who we're electing, it's that not enough people are voting. And it does seems to be like you're spending a lot of time on trying to decide who gets elected when really you should be spending that time trying to get more people to vote.
Yeah, we get to walk and chew gum, so we've done lots of things to try to expand voting. Early voting is a great example. This past election, we passed on the ballot. You probably voted for it, same-day voter registration. I think there's going to be an effort this year in the Ways and Means Committee to expand the number of early voting sites. And, thankfully also we had increased turnout this past year, both in our primary and general election. Frankly, after 2014's dismal turnout, we had little place to go but up, but it's good to see the trend line reversing. I think government can do a lot. Unfortunately, and I know you feel this acutely, part of the issue that I feel in Montgomery County is the lack of media has actually had a big effect on turnout because people only hear about their legislators in Annapolis and frankly sometimes their council members and county exec in Rockville around election time. And I think for people to really want to participate in the process, they need to know more about what's going on with government all the time. So that's why I'm happy about this podcast and everything you're doing at MCM. Happy about Maryland Matters, Bethesda Beat. We really need more restored media attention to what's going on with government so that people are aware of it and are more invested in the process, I think, to get voter turnout to continue rising and stay up.
Let's do a flash round just really quick because a couple other things I want to get to before too long. What's going to happen to beer sales at the state level? It was a big deal last year. Will there be a change in how craft beers are regulated?
We don't have the legislation for the session that affects the whole state yet. We do have some local legislation that would allow some of our craft brewers to brew more. Again, Delegate Lukey has been leading the way on that. So I think you're going to see a continued desire for people to have increased access, safely and drinking responsibly, of course, but increased access to craft beer. So I think the pressure will continue to be on for that. Haven't seen any bills yet.
Okay, and what do you think is going to happen with recreational marijuana in this session?
I don't know if it'll be this session, but I'm fairly confident that we will eventually reach a point where, like gambling, it will go on the ballot and people will have the choice whether or not we want to have recreational marijuana in the state. Regulated, taxed, but I think it's somewhat inevitable in my view, and I support that change. I support treating it like alcohol, frankly like tobacco, where it's taxed, regulated, limited, but available for consenting adults.
And as the delegation chair, you were overseeing the entire House delegation. You say there's 10 new members? 10
of our 24 members are new. Of course, I don't oversee them, but I do have the honor of trying to herd the cats a little bit. Yeah. We now have a majority female delegation. 13 of our 24 members are female, and the delegation looks a lot more like the county as a whole. We have African-American males, African-American females. We have gay members. We have straight members. We have Latina members. We have older members. We have younger members. And I think that's really important because I'm a white, mid-30s male. There's still a bunch of us in the county, but the county, as you know, is majority minority. And so it's important that our delegations start to look a little bit more like the rest of the county. And that's important for when we go to Annapolis to show what our true face is, because people think all of Montgomery County looks like me. There are still some me's left in the county, but it's obviously changed quite a bit. And so it's great that our delegation is reflecting that.
You bring up a subject that I brought up in earlier podcasts, and I'll bring it up with you as well. For a county that's as progressive as Montgomery County, why is it that there's only one woman on the county council? Now you say you've got a majority female at the state level. Why is it so easy, relatively easy, for a woman to get elected to the House of Delegates, and that much more difficult to get elected to the county council?
Well, I'm not sure it's easy. I think my colleague Sarah Love, who serves with me, who won by just a handful of votes, wouldn't say it was easy for her to get there. My other two colleagues in my district are also female. Delegate Kelly, Senator Lee, I wouldn't say they would think it was easy. I do think there's been a concerted effort by groups like Emerge Maryland to try to position women to run better and stronger in these races. So far, I guess there's been more success at the state legislative level. I think, the council will follow. This was an unusual year in our council elections, but I think you're going to continue to see really qualified women run and do well. It's not as though we went from 0 to 1 on the county council. This is actually sort of an aberration that we're down to one woman, I would say, on the county council. To take nothing away from the 8 other great councilmen on the council there, I think it is unfortunate that we only have one woman, but I don't think that's an inevitable part of politics. I think you're going to see qualified women run in 4 years and do well.
Okay, and then finally, you are well known for your book reviews, particularly about history. Who's your favorite president?
Obviously, I think the Washington and Lincoln choices are obvious. As a good partisan Democrat, FDR would be sort of my next after that. If you're looking for something on the more obscure side, my son and I just started, my 7-year-old son, who's really into presidents as well, just started reading with me the Ron Chernow Grant book, which has been interesting so far. So speaking of great writers of history, the book opens describing how he wrote his memoirs and debunking the myth that Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens ghost wrote it for him. So really interesting read.
Grant. We should be looking.
I haven't finished the book yet. That's just I'm just previewing. You'll have me back, and I'll tell you the final review. Okay. Or you can read it on Facebook.
All right. Now's the time to wrap things up. Thank you, Delegate Korman, for joining me. I'm Doug Tallman, senior reporter at Montgomery Community Media. Our engineer today was Allie Potter. And we'll be taking a break over the holiday, and we hope you'll be here for the first session in 2019, and then we'll be talking Montgomery on Montgomery Talk.